So this is a video for microeconomics and it's based on the free market. And it's an argument against government interference. So in other words, government intervention. So the invisible hand and the pricing mechanism suggest that if left to the free market, when there is a disequilibrium, the market will self-correct. So the invisible hand was coined by Adam Smith. And when considering the invisible hand, it's key to remember that it's a metaphor. So it's a metaphor for how, in a free market economy, self-interested individuals operate through a system of interdependence. So this was introduced in Adam Smith's book, The Theory of Moral Sentiment, in 1759. And the invisible hand, it would operate in a competitive market through the pursuit of self-interest to allocate resources in society's best interests. So we can consider market mechanisms, but in this video, we're specifically looking at the pricing mechanism. So before we do anything, I'm going to show you two short introductory videos on the invisible hand, one from BBC Radio 4 and the other one from Open University. And it'll just provide some context before we explore examples of it in action.
In the 18th century, Adam Smith used the metaphor of an invisible hand to describe how individuals making self-interested decisions can collectively and unwittingly engineer an effective economic system that is in the public interest. This is how the invisible hand is usually understood today. When there's plenty of grain on the market, sellers drop their prices to make sales. When it gets scarcer, the price rises and the financial incentive for growing it or importing it gets stronger. The individual buyers, sellers, growers and importers don't set out to act for the public good. They just go about their business thinking about their own gains and losses, buying wherever they can to get the best deal. But out of their self-interested choices in a free market, an efficient economy emerges. And this, allegedly, is superior to any system the state could produce. More recent enthusiasts of free markets, such as Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, have invoked the idea of an invisible hand as an argument against restrictions on trade.
An economy is a tricky thing to control, and governments are always trying to figure out how to do it. Back in 1776, economist Adam Smith shocked everyone by saying that what governments should actually do is just leave people alone to buy and sell freely among themselves. He suggested that if they just leave self-interested traders to compete with one another, markets are guided to positive outcomes as if by an invisible hand. If someone charges less than you, customers will buy from them instead, so you have to lower the price or offer something better. Whenever enough people demand something, they will be supplied by the market, like spoilt children, only in this case everyone's happy. Later free marketeers, like Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek, argued that this hands-off approach actually works better than any kind of central plan. But the problem is economies can take a long time to reach their equilibrium and may even stall along the way. And in the meantime, people can get a little frustrated.
So, the pricing mechanism. What do I mean by this? Well, it's a term used to describe by which the many millions of decisions taken each day by consumers and producers interact to determine the allocation of scarce resources between obviously the competing users. Right, Alfred Marshall, he added considerable detail to how the pricing mechanism works. So in this video, we're going to explore excess demand, excess supply, some supply shortages, which may result in, for example, that disequilibrium, but with the free market correcting the situation on its own. So, there's key terminology that you must use when answering questions on the free market and when using the price mechanism argument. One being the incentive function. So the incentive function refers to economic agents responding to appropriate price signals in the market. So when we're thinking about incentives, we of course need to know what the signaling function is. So the signaling function is another key aspect of the pricing mechanism. So this means that the market prices will adjust to demonstrate where resources are required and where they are not needed. So if there's scarcity, it'll be a signal that prices need to be increased. This will then signal to producers to enter the market. We also have the preference function. And the preference function, this helps to provide the signals. So, for example, if there's excess demand, it shows customer preference towards their desire to buy this good. Then this then can act as a signal for producers to raise prices and then to increase production. So it's important to remember that we are assuming that customers also respond to these price signals. So when, for example, there's excess supply, suppliers may lower prices, which may alter the preference of customers towards the good. And finally, the last key term that you really need to know as part of the pricing mechanism, and that's rationing. So, finally, the rationing function, prices serve to ration scarce resources. So, I'll give you a quick example. When demand in a market outstrips supply, then prices rise and customers must ration. Because again, it's now more expensive, and some customers, their preference is perhaps not to pay those prices to buy those goods, or not to buy as many of those goods. So let's put it into action. If we consider excess demand, the first thing you need to consider is, well, how would firms even know that there's excess demand? Well, there'll be signals. So these signs and these signals could be perhaps longer waiting times. It could be increased backlogs. It could be an empty stockroom, and this scarcity then signals for producers to put up their prices. So let's have a look at the diagram. So what we have is we have excess demand at the current price at Q star. So the signal tells producers to put up the prices because of everything that I've just said. This then incentivizes producers to produce more and signals to producers to enter the market. So we see an extension of supply. But then from this point of excess demand, those customers might start to change their preference due to the higher prices at P2. And we see it contract as customers ration, and because they ration, it moves to the new market equilibrium where supply and demand meet, which is going to be at P2, Q2, with a new demand curve showing an increase of demand, which previously was occurring, but remember it was in disequilibrium. So now we have a new market clearing price and this new market equilibrium. Now, how long would that take? We don't know that, okay? But the whole idea of the price mechanism is how it gets to that new market equilibrium, and I suppose the journey of the invisible hand. So now in this next situation, we have excess supply. Again, what signs, what signals? Well, maybe we have a full stockroom. Maybe we have a lack of footfall. So what happens? Well, it signals to producers to lower prices. So again, via the diagram, we have Q star, but this time the Q star shows excess of supply. Suppliers have the signal to lower prices, and this also signals to suppliers to leave the market, and they ration their production. Customers are incentivized to demand more, and it even signals to consumers to enter the market. So now we have an extension of demand because of P2, but we have a contraction from that excess supply point, as we can see there, because again they've lowered prices because they've been signaled to do so, but it's also signaled to suppliers to leave the market and ration their production. So we've got the new market equilibrium of P2, Q2. Right, now let's imagine that there's a shortage and there's some form of shock which has hit this specific market. So let's imagine there was a shortage of supply, and that's at, again, Q star. And for whatever reason, we've got that shortage where at P1 we've got Q star and it's in disequilibrium. So what happens? Well, it signals to producers to raise prices. This then signals to producers, giving them the incentive to come into the market and obviously produce more, which helps with the shortage. As prices rise, what we see is again customers changing their preference and starting to ration from what they were demanding at the initial market equilibrium. And what we have is a supply shift to the left and back to the equilibrium. So even though there is a shortage, that shortage doesn't necessarily mean it has to be in disequilibrium if the invisible hand is at work. Now, one way of remembering the price mechanism and making sure that you do mention the terms such as rationing and incentives and preference and signals is possibly maybe an acronym like RIPS. Okay, so we've got obviously R standing for rationing, I incentives, P preference, S signals. Obviously it's not in that order, but it might be just a way just to kind of remind yourself when you're answering a question on this, because these key terms are so important when answering questions on why it's best to leave it to the free market. But It is also worth remembering that in reality, no market is free, as there's already been some form of government intervention, and that may have already distorted the market. But I did want to give examples of when the government does intervene and distorts the price mechanism, so in other words, causes that disequilibrium. So what I'm going to do in a minute is consider price controls. But before I do that, I just want to quickly go over the invisible hand one more time and just remind you that the invisible hand, it does refer to a laissez-faire approach to the market. So what I mean by that is let do, let go, making it free. So by allowing the price mechanism to act, what it should do, it should fulfill the needs and desires of economic agents. Right, so let's quickly consider why government intervention might distort the market and it might cause that disequilibrium. So again, if we look at the price floor, let's put a price floor here above the market equilibrium, and what we've got is this situation where there's excess supply. And again, that's because of that artificial price. Another one, we've got price ceiling. So let's put the price ceiling below the market equilibrium. And what we've got here is we've got excess demand. So again, because of the government intervention, this has distorted the market. It's harmed the price mechanism, and therefore it cannot self-correct because of the government intervention.